Welcome, everybody. My name is Richard Horton, and I'm editor of the medical journal, The Lancet. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to be your moderator at this very exciting launch of the latest report from the former co-chairs of the independent panel on pandemic preparedness and response. I'd like to especially thank our hosts, the Club de Madrid, for helping us organize this launch. We have an extraordinary set of speakers for you. I think that there is no question, if you look back, that the independent panel produced the most comprehensive and far-reaching assessment of the global pandemic response, with a set of recommendations that, if they were implemented, would do much to secure our protection from future pandemic threats. So what is the present state of the response to the independent panel's guidance? I am delighted to introduce the co-chair of the independent panel, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark, who will present a brief summary of their latest report, which is entitled, quite appropriately, "No Time to Gamble, Leaders Must Unite to Prevent Pandemics." Helen, over to you.
Well, thanks, Richard, and big thanks to you for making time in your busy life to moderate today's launch event. And of course, also big thanks to the Club de Madrid. I'm a member, and the Club de Madrid's been taking a huge interest in supporting reform to pandemic preparedness and response globally. I'm speaking on behalf of my colleague, former co-chair Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia. Unfortunately, President Sirleaf couldn't be with us today. She's had a death in the family, and it's the funeral today. So we're thinking of her, and she's very much with us in spirit and has given the work tremendous support. So we are speaking today with the same urgency as we did to the World Health Assembly in May 2021, when we put forward the package of recommendations, which was aimed at making COVID-19 the last pandemic of such devastation. We were clear that leaders needed to come together to act, to make transformative change in the preparedness and response system. We called for a new approach to financing preparedness and response, new ways of managing equitable access to products like vaccines, therapeutics, and tests. And we called for a new framework convention at WHO to complement the rules, the international health regs, around outbreaks and pandemics. Now, of course, the additional funds which did come in pale in comparison to the needs. We see high-income countries holding on very tightly to traditional charity-based approaches to providing the essential tools to fight pandemics. The pandemic agreement has been 2.5 years in the making and may require yet another year in order to be successful, which we very much hope. In short, if there were a new pandemic threat today, such as if H5N1 began to spread from person to person at scale, the world would likely be overwhelmed again. We just aren't equipped enough to stop outbreaks before they spread further. For example, this clade 1 type of mpox is spreading and has already led to the deaths of about 1,000 people in Democratic Republic of Congo, 85% of whom are children under the age of 15. DRC has no vaccines yet in country, I'm told. They are available in high-income countries, and there's very low testing capacity in DRC. Let us note also that South Africa has, I understand, around 7 identified cases of mpox clade 2B, and 2, sadly, of those detected with it have died, and South Africa is still waiting for vaccines and treatment, according to Health Policy Watch yesterday. So if we don't take these issues as serious, we really are gambling with our futures. And that's our message. We need leaders to step up for change now. So the report looks at 7 key areas. I'm not going to go over all of them today, but in brief: political leadership, country preparedness, financing, the independence and authority of WHO, the system of surveillance, alert and response, access to medical countermeasures, and accountability. I'll focus on the leadership, finance, and access to countermeasures primarily, but just on a couple of the other areas. Look, there have been some encouraging developments. I'm encouraged that there was agreement at the on amendments to the IHR. They may have not been everything that everyone called for, but so far so good. They will have to be fully implemented. Countries have got to really accept them and drive them forward. But let's take some encouragement from what happened, and let's hope it might create a positive momentum to flow through to the pandemic agreement talks, which are ongoing. We've been encouraged in recent years when the World Health Assembly did vote to provide WHO with a gradual increase over time in its base program funding. That was positive, bit of a long time scale, but nonetheless. We've made recommendations of the past about one term for future DGs at WHO and regional directors, not yet taken up, but we still see the merit. We are noting with concern that WHO's spending on emergencies, and we have so many emergencies, of course, is far outstripping spending on other pillars, including the important work on universal health coverage, better health and wellbeing, NCDs, social determinants, you name it. And we pose an open question, and I stress it is an open question: should WHO be split into two organisations? One that is focused on emergency operations, as that work has to be done, and one that's focused on operational and technical excellence in health. Both are important and need focus. Come to the question, are countries prepared for future pandemic threats? Well, actually, it's very hard to know. There's no obvious dashboard anywhere. There's a patchwork of information across different tools and instruments. The truth is some countries will be, many won't be, but we have no bird's eye view. And we do recommend a truly independent monitoring mechanism be established. That could be either a global preparedness monitoring board, which is completely independent of WHO, which it isn't at the moment, or a new independent monitoring group, perhaps on the climate change intergovernmental panel model, where you have experts with a standing brief. On the issue of accountability, we haven't seen sufficient focus on this in either the amended health regulations or the current texts of the pandemic agreement. So, coming to political leadership. As is well known, we called for a Global Health Threats Council 3 years ago at the leadership level to keep momentum for transformation in the preparedness response system. The idea didn't get the traction it needed, and unfortunately, we've seen political leadership on pandemic preparedness and response issues just fade away as COVID has become an endemic disease. But as I've mentioned, pandemic threats are always with us. The human-to-human outbreak of H5N1 would be more disastrous, potentially, than COVID-19. And we are recommending in this report the formation of what we're calling a group of champions to prevent pandemics, which could include former and present leaders. And I can certainly speak for President Sirleaf as well. We're up for it to continue to champion. Ideally, we need to see current leaders come on board and really get a group that's motivated to advocate for this at a high level. I would also say that with a pandemic agreement, it needs a conference of parties mechanism. And in that mechanism, it needs a leader level meeting from time to time, not suggesting every year, but leaders need to keep a focus on what's happening. We're also recommending, when the Summit of the Future, a declaration, Pact for the Future, is adopted later this year, that it most certainly should include the emergency platform for complex global shocks, which the Secretary General has proposed, and that should go beyond reaction to actually include preparedness. Obviously, leadership needs to be applied to preventing disasters, not just responding to them. On the issue of financing, we and others have estimated that you need at least that 10 to 15 billion every year to support low and middle income countries to strengthen preparedness. We say it should be additional to official development assistance, A, because there's not much of it, and B, because it addresses a global common good. We continue to advocate a global public investment model for this, where everyone pays in and country allocation is according to need. And there also needs to be a surge mechanism to create the up to 100 billion a year, which would be required should a pandemic threat materialize. We are recommending the conversion of the current pandemic fund at the World Bank into a preparedness and surge response mechanism based on a global public investment model. Now, on countermeasures, the lack of equitable access to countermeasures has been at the very heart of the challenge in negotiating a new pandemic agreement. And in a sense, it's a miracle that the international health regulations were able to be agreed. We continue to recommend investment in regional and sub-regional hubs covering R&D, manufacturing, and distribution. These require knowledge and tech transfer and the freedom to operate in times of crisis. They can't be developed overnight. There are many issues, including regulatory ones, to resolve. But if we don't start now, when can this change happen? So, in closing, if President Sirleaf were here, she would talk personally about the need for the world to stop learning lessons and begin to apply the lessons of what has happened with pandemics. 10 years ago, she faced that growing Ebola outbreak in her country. She asked for international help. It eventually came, but it was late. 11,000 people died. The world learned a lot of lessons, which were well documented in reports, which were largely not applied. Then 5 years later, COVID struck and spread globally. More than 28 million excess deaths since then. Again, more lessons. We don't need to learn again. It's urgent to take action. It's time for political leaders to step up, re-engage with these issues, and see us through to a full pandemic agreement, decent financing, and equitable countermeasures. Back to you, Richard.
Fantastic, Helen. That was a brilliant summary of a really important report. The embargo was lifted on this report at the beginning of this webinar. I really encourage you strongly to read it. It's rigorous, it's practical, and it focuses on actions that can be taken at the country and global levels. It's really essential reading. Now let's talk about the practical aspects of what we need to do, and we're going to try and do that through the lens of one particular country, Singapore, putting those learnings into action. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce the Minister for Health of Singapore, Mr. Ong Ye Kung. And Mr. Kung, I'd like you to give your personal reflections, if you would please, about your time managing the pandemic and what Singapore is now putting in place. Over to you.
Thank you, honorable co-chairs, friends, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this launch event. My task today is to share the lessons that Singapore has learned from the pandemic and how we are putting these lessons into practice and to prepare ourselves for the next pandemic. Post-COVID-19 pandemic, Singapore did a comprehensive review of our responses, and we documented it in a white paper, which we debated in Parliament. We noted the responses that were effective, but we also acknowledged areas where we have fallen short. All in all, we think this is quite a transparent and open process. The lessons are many, so let me focus on just one key thrust, which is that governments, just like any other organizations, we are prone to make the mistake of fighting the last war. And that was the case for COVID-19 as well. And let me explain. In many East Asian countries where we live in, our response was based on what we learned from SARS. During SARS, we could snuff out the pandemic through thorough contact tracing and isolation. In Western countries, on the other hand, their responses, I think, are based on what they learned during a bad influenza season. So they tried to ride through the epidemic with higher than usual patient load at hospitals, but eventually things will subside and go back to normal. Both approaches turned out to be unworkable because they were fundamentally responses to the last war that the respective regions have experienced. So in many East Asian countries, including Singapore, we soon realized that COVID-19 was far more transmissible than SARS, and we could not possibly contain it through tracing and isolation. On the other hand, Western countries found out that COVID-19 was much more severe than influenza, and trying to ride through the transmission wave overwhelmed their hospitals, leading to more deaths. So while we learn lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic, I think the more enduring insight or even wisdom is to expect the next pandemic to be different from COVID-19. We need to be prepared for the worst case scenario, meaning the next pandemic could be as severe as SARS and as transmissible as an influenza virus. When that happens, and we accept that in a pandemic, our common mission as healthcare jurisdiction is to minimize deaths, then we need a full range of measures. And I will summarize this full range of measures into 3 categories, and that is Singapore's conclusion. First, we need social restrictions up to and including a lockdown to minimize the number of people infected by the disease. Second, we will sooner or later need vaccines and other medical countermeasures so that we minimize the risk of infected persons from developing severe illnesses. And third, we need adequate and competent healthcare facilities so that even for those who are infected and develop severe illnesses, they can be treated and saved successfully. The first response, social restriction to minimize infection, is entirely domestic. Governments need to prepare its people to accept such measures, no matter how draconian they are, in an emergency. So in Singapore, we amended our Infectious Diseases Act to confer the authorities the ability to implement appropriate social restrictions and response during a pandemic alert or during an emergency. However, the second and third response, the second is having vaccines and medical countermeasures. The third is adequate healthcare facilities. These are not merely domestic efforts. Developing vaccines and medical countermeasures, for example, is a global effort. Singapore is contributing to the 100-day mission with our niche expertise. But this is all we have, niche expertise. We don't have all the expertise to develop an effective vaccine for the next pandemic. So we're not seeking to develop a Singapore vaccine for the next pandemic. We are working with scientists around the world to develop the best possible vaccine, the most effective vaccine in as short a time as possible. The world experienced the trauma and the agony of vaccine inequity during COVID-19, which continues to be a major contention today. In my view, the best way to address vaccine inequity is to build up production capacity when we have the time and the space to do so. A capacity is not built up through coercion and force, but by encouraging and facilitating investment from the pharmaceutical industry. And governments need to be a strong partner to industry, incentivize them to continue to conduct R&D, formulation, production, and then distribution. Through this approach, Singapore has thus far attracted 5 vaccine manufacturers to set up production facilities in Singapore, which will, in steady state, produce over 1 billion vaccine doses annually. Our domestic needs are relatively small, so we have no doubt that these facilities will be producing for the region and the world. As for the adequacy of healthcare system, while it is a domestic response, many countries of the global south require support and help. They will need capacity building, strengthen their disease surveillance system, better equip primary care, and expand acute care. And this will require global financing. That is the motivation in setting up the pandemic fund, which currently is under the supervision of the World Bank. That is also why Singapore pledged US about $18 million to support the WHO investment round for its 2025-2028 work plan. And we hope to prioritize our contribution for capacity building amongst developing countries and hopefully catalyze contributions by other nations. Finally, I'd like to thank the IPPPR for its work over the past few years. And I look forward to your continued efforts to better inform the world as we brace ourselves for the next pandemic, which is a matter of when and not if. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister. That was a crystal clear analysis of what we need to do, and your message about expecting the next pandemic to be different couldn't be more important. So now let's move on to investigate how ready we are for the next pandemic threat in our first in conversation segment. And we've got three great speakers for you with enormous experience to bring to bear on this question. Let me introduce the three of them, and then I'll give them the floor to give their initial reflections. First, the Minister of Health for Indonesia, Minister Budi Gunadi Sadikin, welcome. The Chief Executive of Afrigen Biologic, Petro Tablanche, welcome Petro, great to see you again. And the founder and chief executive of the Center for Indonesia's Strategic Development Initiatives, Dia Saminasi. Welcome to you too. So let's start with Minister Budi. Would you like to give some reflections on how ready we are for the next pandemic threat?
Yes, throughout history, battle against pathogen had claimed more compared with battle with other things. Tuberculosis killed 1 billion people. Black Death killed 200 million people. Those are the biggest war against pathogen. Compared with battle against human, World War II, the biggest, only killed 85 million. Or battle against nature, the biggest natural disaster recorded was Yangtze River flood, 4 million. So it's very clear that pathogen, war with pathogen, several times claim millions or 100 millions of life. So that's why in war, you are better well-planned and well-prepared. That is the reason why I strongly believe we have to invest time and resources into this pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. Indonesia, during the last presidency in G20, we established the pandemic fund with the G20 countries. And that is a continuation of the ideas from Italian presidency before. But during that time, I realized it is not enough. We need also the pandemic agreement. That's why here on this occasion, to Helen also, I would like to deliver two things that I believe during the early discussion about the establishment of pandemic fund, I am really afraid that these two things are missing. The first one, the pandemic fund should provide us enough war chest for peacetime and wartime. There are a lot of things that has been done during peacetime, in strengthening healthcare systems, surveillance, etc. I don't want to talk about it. But I'm really afraid that we are not ready for the fund for wartime. Like you mentioned, if tomorrow another pandemic happened, H5N1, we are not ready. Where wartime required different response, different disbursement fund mechanism. It is like you're comparing the IMF and World Bank. During peacetime, standard decision-making guided by strategic plan, rigorous risk management is the way to disperse fund. And on our last experience, that is what happened. It takes a long time to disperse the fund. During wartime, you need a speedy decision-making, expedited fund disbursement, rapid risk management or risk ring-fencing process. And the fund should be play as a role of catalyst where the next bigger, powerful funds coming in. So it's like in financial crisis, global financial crisis, they have the IMF that can disperse billions of US dollars in weeks. We should be able to create that mechanism. So my first suggestion is strongly the pandemic fund, the mandate should be separated between peacetime and wartime. While the peacetime is already started, and there are a lot of many institutions like Global Fund, Gavi, WHO, they are working on the peacetime side. But in the wartime, we are not ready. We are not ready with the money. That is input number one. Input number two, different with financial crisis, because many people coming from financial sector would like to give an input for this global health crisis. The differentiation between global health crisis and global financial crisis. With global financial crisis, with the money from IMF, you give it to the country, it's done. With global health crisis, Indonesia have money. I cannot access the emergency medical countermeasure, the vaccine, the therapeutic, the diagnostic. So it's very important for every government. They have to think about getting access to emergency medical countermeasure. Money alone is not enough. That's why when the G20 presidency said, okay, we established the pandemic fund, I said, that is not done. It's only 50% of the job. We need to finish this pandemic treaty, which has been delayed, like what Helen mentioned, because we need to convert this money to access to emergency medical countermeasure. And the basic principle, in my view, during pandemic, we need to be clear, because to save 100 millions of lives, we need to convert this emergency medical countermeasure from private good to public good. That is extremely important. So what we need to do is, I coming from banking background, I understand the private company need to have return to their investment. We need to have in the pandemic agreement an upfront agreement where the private companies that have to give answer to their shareholder will be well compensated reasonably by a large public institution like Gavi or Global Fund or Pandemic Fund or strong country like United States, EU, billions of US dollars to make sure that temporarily during this pandemic, all emergency medical countermeasure, vaccine, therapeutic, diagnostic become public good. So all countries can have access to it. So this is what key component which I believe should be in the pandemic agreement or pandemic treaty. We need also to have a formal governance structure. Before, during crisis, we have scrambling. Who lead this initiative? We established an Act A, which is performing okay, but we need to formalize this government structure early. So this government structure will deal globally with the umbrella agreement with the countries. So each of developing country doesn't have to negotiating one by one to the pharmaceutical company to get the agreement signed. It will take 6 months or 12 months and kill millions of people during the day. How to control the supply, the delivery, the fulfillment to the people. So those kind of things need a formal global governance structure. So that is the second topic. So I'd like to repeat again. Number one, we need to expand the mandate of pandemic fund during peacetime and wartime. And we need to focus on the money during wartime because a different rapid decision-making, a speedy disbursement. Second, we need to make sure we have the global governance structure that establish a global management process for conversion or access to emergency medical countermeasure during crisis. And with the principle, they should be temporarily moved from private goods to public goods. And we compensate the private sector to produce it or incentivize them with giving them early capital, to make sure they can produce the required emergency medical countermeasure. So those two input, I think it's very critical for us in the future. And then we have to stop thinking and start doing. We have to stop discussion and start doing actions, because we believe that we need to prepare our next generations and the generation after next generation to be ready to win the next war against pathogen now. Thank you.
Good. Mr. Budi, thank you very much for that clear exposition. Let me go straight to Petro, to Blanche. Petro, great to see you. From your position as Chief Executive of Afrigen Biologic, are we ready for the next pandemic?
Richard and Alan, thank you very much. I'm very privileged to be part of this session. Let me give a partial answer. Knowledge alone did not, and will not translate into preparedness and equity and access. We need to be very carefully implement and translate the knowledge we have. During the last 3 years, the knowledge base of the world around pandemic response, pandemic preparedness has tripled. And yet, I think if we have a pandemic today, the global north will move at speed and will be better prepared than 3 years ago because of the knowledge that we've been able to possess. But I fear that for the global south, where where critical medical countermeasures are produced matters, and where an enabling ecosystem needs to be in place to ensure access and equity and rapid response, we're not there yet. Have we come a long way? Yes, we have. And if I can make some comments about my own continent, Africa, building an ecosystem. In 2 days from now, the Gavi-AFMA agreement will be signed, providing enablement and access and opportunities for local manufacturers to move forward. The hurdles are high, but the opportunities are there. But there are so many initiatives, there are so many meetings, there are so much funding and numbers being put on the table, but it's not coordinated. Sometimes we get lost in all of this. There is a need, I believe, for better coordination. I think Helen said it earlier. Coordinated implementation plan that has the global world's well-being at mind, not only different regions of the world. And then I think the other challenge we have is, I call it criticality. And this is not a nuclear term. It is criticality in funding. And if I can use the mRNA technology transfer program, a great leadership program, which encompasses and embraces end-to-end research, development, manufacturing capability, platform-based, pipeline, inter-pandemic sustainability. That program's final output are threatened now by lack of funding. So unless we also reach criticality in the funding of global priorities that will meet some of the critical necessities of end-to-end research and manufacturing capabilities in low middle income countries, we will be unprepared for future pandemics, and we will be unable to prioritize disease burdens in these regions. The African continent in 2023 had 155 outbreaks. If we analyze those, for less than 10, there are vaccines available, and for about only 2 of them, there are now efforts, concrete efforts, to create local manufacturing capabilities. We have a long way to go, but unless we prioritize correctly and we coordinate well and we resource well, I fear that the global south will not be prepared ever for a next pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Petro. And what you're saying is that we're creating 2 worlds here. Our inequities are deepening rather than us bridging the gap between those 2 worlds. We're moving further apart, which is a pretty frightening place to be in after what we've gone through the past 4 years. Let me turn next to Dia Saminasi, who is the founder and Chief Executive of the Center for Indonesia's Strategic Development Initiatives. Dia, from your perspective in Indonesia, are we ready?
Well, that's a very loaded question, Richard, and I think I have to tread carefully in answering that, because it's unpacking so many things, and it's different from a different perspective or different angles, depending on how you look at it. I mean, the situation have been laid out by Minister Budi, Minister Ong, and also by Helen, and I think it's a characteristic that is shared by so many countries, in particular low-middle income countries in the global south. From the perspective of civil society, I think it's always a thread in the finest lines, where are we positioned or how are we perceived and construed by our other development partners, meaning other stakeholders in development, not donors. The government, the private sector, academia, and other development actors. In this particular conversation about pandemic preparedness, in particular the pandemic agreement, civil society have been left out from the overall conversation of pandemic agreement and the pandemic treaty, and how can civil society be meaningfully engaged remain a question in the past 2 years of this pandemic agreement negotiation. However, I think in some areas, meaningful engagement of civil society have been improved significantly. I would like to point the case in the governing board of the Pandemic Fund, where there are 2 civil society representatives that have voting rights in the Pandemic Fund governing board. I think as a first step, that is a very promising first step towards the wider engagement of civil society. Why? Because there are 2 things. One, we talk about resource, that we need more resource for preparedness in the pandemic, in the next one. However, we know resources are very difficult, increasingly difficult to generate, and we appreciate that the pandemic, that this report is pushing for the Pandemic Fund to, like Helen just pointed out, move to search financing and preparedness. This is the critical point where I think civil society can utilize our networks, our vast networks globally at all levels in government and governance, from national, regional, and global level, and then be active in making sure that there are resources that coming towards this preparedness effort. The other part that I would like to point out is that there is actually a mechanism called GPI, where it is that is working on the principles of this very fundamental of engagement of all stakeholder participation. It advocates fair share decision-making power among stakeholders, and it also enable, if we implement that principles, it will enable the wider civil society network to bring the resource and into this catalytic funding, and if possible, perhaps move catalytic funding from catalytic funding to, as highlighted by this report, preparedness and search financing. The second point that I would like to point out is that Helen's point about independent monitoring and accountability mechanism, which has been I think it's in the beginning of this year, when the Pandemic Action Network organized civil society consultation on the pandemic agreement, that idea has been brought about as well. And it's independent in a sense that it is free from member states, WHO, and donor influence, which maintain and hold political, technical, and operational independence as well. So I think that is where, if civil society are going to be involved and engaged in this whole new set of dynamics at the global level, but also more importantly at national level, then those 2 are the entry points and the space that can be created by civil society for civil society. I will end there. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks very much, Dia. I'm really delighted that you ended on your point about independent accountability. That is so crucial. And of course, it makes countries very nervous. They don't like the word accountability. They might go as far as accepting review, but the notion of independent monitoring and evaluation is anathema to many, and yet it can be such a powerful political force. Now, we do have a few minutes for questions, and we've had a question from the audience, and it's around remembering that we're asking the question, are we ready for the next pandemic threat? And it's a question that focuses on the very low investment in addressing zoonotic spillover infections. And in the context of what we've already been discussing during this webinar, H5N1, if we paid attention to animal health, then we could actually have a big impact on reducing the risk of a zoonotic infection. So can I ask the three of you your perspectives on animal health in preventing another pandemic? Are we doing enough, and what more do we need to do? Who would like to speak to that? Go on, Petro. Thank you.
Let me start, Richard. Firstly, I think it's critically important. If I go back to the African continent, if you look at some of the most concerning outbreaks, although they are in small communities, they are zoonotic diseases. They are One Health concept. They are West Nile fever. They are Rift Valley fever. These are high mortality outbreaks, although in smaller groups. Unless we prioritize a One Health approach, I think we will also remain very vulnerable. Maybe just a comment on the Rift Valley fever. This is one of the opportunities where one could actually develop a single vaccine using an antigen, using mRNA to both for the vaccination of animals, livestock, and humans. So I think we should more and more from an R&D and product development perspective also prioritize approaches which are innovative and which will address both the human component and our livestock and veterinary components. I think it's critically important as a priority.
Thanks, Petro. I'm just going to ask Dia as well, from a civil society perspective on advocacy around One Health. Do you have any reflections? It's very difficult. It's a phrase that's used a lot, I noticed, at the World Health Assembly meeting, but in terms of actually action, less so.
Yes, and I second your point about how to put out a different narrative so that we do not sound like a broken record, Richard, on when we talk about response and preparedness. And to the point on One Health, I think with the risk of sounding like a broken record, I think we are not learning enough from the lessons in the pandemic response 3 years ago, where civil society carrying out as the executioners of government policies, and also the policy entrepreneurs, where they take these policies further and improvise on what the community needs and then deliver the response to the public. And that includes the point about One Health and animal health and the ecosystem where communities live. I think we should go back and relearn what we missed from the communities and the community health workers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dia. Well, look, let's take a shift of perspective now, because and Helen mentioned this in her opening remarks about the centrality of financing. So let's talk to a former finance minister, the former finance minister of Colombia. It's a great pleasure to welcome Minister Mauricio Cárdenas. He's also a former member of the independent panel. So let me ask you, please, Mauricio Cárdenas, how can we transform the rather lackluster place we're at the moment for financing for pandemic preparedness and response, and bridge that gap between what we know is needed and what seems to be available? There's so many calls on funding. We have Gavi replenishment, we have a global fund replenishment coming up in the next couple of years. We have the pandemic fund. How are we going to manage these competing calls on financing?
Well, thanks very much, Richard. And I would add to that, at a time when public finances are under a lot of stress in the different countries, mainly because of the high levels of debt and very high interest rates that are prevailing today in the world. So the fiscal space, so to speak, is much more limited. So, well, first of all, thanks so much for inviting me for the launch of this report. What better title than No Time to Gamble, after 28 million excess deaths due to COVID-19, after knowing that every 5 or 6 years we have a new health crisis of global concern, and also knowing that the level of preparedness and the capacity to respond to a new emergent crisis is very limited. We would not be better prepared now than what we were at the onset of 2020. So public finances play a very important role because domestic resource mobilization is crucial, and that should be the foundation of the response. I mean, the preparedness and the response, but that's not enough. We need international finance, but we don't need charity. And I think that's the main message. It sounds a bit strong, but it's true. Preparedness is not about aid. Preparedness is about having resources and capabilities to provide a global common or a global public good. Because, I mean, with 100 million commercial flights, 100,000 commercial flights per day, you can imagine that, I mean, the spread of viruses goes at a very fast pace. So the world is as prepared as the weakest link in this chain is. So we have to worry about small, low-income, middle-income countries that are not well prepared. So they're encouraging news. I mean, the world needs $10 to $15 billion per year for preparedness and an immediate response to a crisis. The creation of the pandemic fund was an important step, but it's still a very small step because we need 10 to 15 billion. The pandemic fund has disbursed 1.4 billion. So, I mean, there's a huge gap. And also we need more coordination among the different and various entities that provide financing. I mean, there is the IMF, there is the World Bank, there is the regional development banks, there is Gavi, there is the pandemic fund, of course. So I think coordination is a very important issue here. The new IHR regulations are encouraging because they actually require for this type of coordination to emerge. So that's point number one. But we also need to ensure that we treat the pandemic fund as a global public good. And that means that it has to be replenished in a really large scale. And the G20 meeting later this year in November, it's a good opportunity to call for greater action in that front. We don't need to reinvent the pandemic fund. It's a good step, but we just need to make sure that we expand it to be able to deliver to what's necessary. And I'd say also that we need to transform it because it's not just about preparedness. It's about having a facility that can actually search financing for a response, including the ability to access countermeasures to deal with a pandemic in the case it emerges. So it's a transformation of the pandemic fund. Governance issues are also important because it's too much donor-driven, and I think we need also a greater representation in the pandemic fund of end users of those resources. And finally, and with this I'll conclude, we also make a call for the IMF. I mean, the IMF has stepped up its role in basically leveraging the conversation about global public goods. It's working a lot on climate. I think we need to make sure that the IMF is also equally interested in pandemics and pandemic preparedness. And one way of doing, I mean, there are two ways of doing this. One is to ensure that in the Article 4 consultations, which is the reports that the IMF puts together every year about how economies can deal with crisis, pandemic crisis should be a very important element there, and the economic response to a pandemic crisis is crucial. And two, additional funding through the various mechanisms and windows that the IMF has. So I think that the call to IMF is a very important step, and it's a strongly made in this report. So I will end that with that. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you very much, Mauricio. That's great insights from you. And we really need to do a better job in the health community of bringing in economists, bringing in finance ministers to be part of this conversation. This is not something we've traditionally done. I think you bring a rigor and practical political perspective that we in health sometimes, if I may say, leave to one side to our detriment. Now let's come to the final segment of our discussion, which is really about political commitment and trust. and it's entitled Uniting Leaders to Prevent Future Pandemics. I think during the pandemic, we saw some political leaders ignore the emerging evidence about how to protect their populations. We saw the rise of new movements that disputed science and questioned the safety of vaccines. And we saw a spectacular failure in global cooperation that led to vast and, again, frankly, unacceptable inequities in the distribution of PPE, diagnostics, vaccines, and medicines themselves. So what can we do is the question for this segment. What can we do to secure political commitment and to build trust for the future? We've got three great speakers. Let me introduce them. And then I will give them the floor. First, Danilo Turk, who was the president of Slovenia between 2007 and 2012. And importantly for today's webinar, he is the president of the Club de Madrid. Thank you for hosting us. Yodi Alakija, who is the WHO Special Envoy for ACT A, and she's the chair of FIND. And of course, finally, our very own Helen Clark, who's the co-author of this report. So let's start, please, with Danilo Turk. Political commitment and trust. How do we build them?
Well, thank you for having me in this important discussion, and I'd like to start by congratulating the authors of the No Time to Gamble, Leaders Must Unite to Prevent Pandemics. And of course, the title of this report already says very much, perhaps the main thing, which is the leaders must unite. And of course, it's understood that this is not a simple task, especially if one looks at this task from the perspective of the experience with COVID-19. We all remember that when the pandemic broke out, we have heard a lot of divergent voices, some of them really criticizing WHO as the main problem in the whole picture, which of course was a very wrong approach. And then there was also another approach which actually expected WHO to do things which are not doable by an organization like WHO. And all this and other phenomena showed how deficient leadership at the global level is. We practically didn't see an appropriate mobilization of global leadership. And that in fact, was a critical problem. As the pandemic developed further, it became clear that the response to pandemic has to deal with all kinds of aspects. Obviously, the medical aspects were in the center, but there were important other aspects: economic, financial, security, and obviously the quality of political cooperation at the global level. Let us not forget, when vaccines became available, they were not available everywhere. And we learned about a new term, vaccine apartheid. We must not forget the experience from the past. And therefore, if one talks about the question of how to generate political will, I think one has to start with recalling that this was the COVID-19 was really a terrible shock, which was also a shock for global leadership. Now that must be there. And I'm saying this because right now I don't see that sort of awareness available. Now the world is worried about wars. It's worried about nuclear weapons. It's worried about all kinds of things. And of course, not enough attention is being paid to pandemic prevention and response. And I think that therefore this report is very timely, and it contains a very useful idea, which I would really like to emphasize very strongly, and that is to bring champions, to create a group of champions to prevent pandemics. That such a group has to be formed. In the UN and more generally in the global affairs, we see that without committed group of leading countries and leaders, committed champions, very little progress can be made. And we remember that from the time of HIV/AIDS, the champions did emerge, not immediately, but over time, there was a group of countries, a group of leaders who personally took the burden of being champions. Kofi Annan, my former boss, was one of them. And we need this sort of championship now again. There will be in September the Summit for the Future, which will provide an opportunity to not only deal with other aspects of the future, but also deal with health aspects of the future very strongly. And I would urge that a group of champions try to be put together in September and in the immediate weeks after that. Of course, there will be other aspects where we need to figure out how to link the champions in the field of prevention of pandemics with other priorities like financing for developments, like climate priorities. These things have to be coordinated in a wise manner. I don't have the time to elaborate on this, and I think that elaboration will come if the first step, the step of bringing together a group of champions succeeds. Then, of course, the rest will start and could be successful. So now this is my contribution to the discussion, and thank you very much once again for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed for your reflections. Let me go straight to Yodi. Yodi Alakija, you've been in a very special place, Yodi, right on the front lines while political commitment and trust has unfortunately drained away. What can we do better for the future?
Thank you very much, Richard. It's lovely to see you and an honor to be here. I would like to congratulate the former independent panel and all of you, and especially Christine, working behind the scenes for the launch of this report today. I was honored to be a part of the pre-launch here in Sydney, and we're talking a lot about political commitment. What can we do? I mean, front lines, I've been at the front lines of the political side of things in Africa at the very beginning, as I was appointed by the Bureau of Heads of States for Africa as the head of the Africa Vaccine Delivery Alliance. I saw what went on there because there was no, well, first of all, the political commitment wasn't followed by money. You know, we say in my language, money is a bicycle upon which good works rides. So, you know, they appointed us and they created all of these structures, but they didn't give us any money. So when we invited the likes of COVAX and various people before I became part of ACT-A into our sort of weekly meetings, which was all we could do because nobody had met the Abuja commitment, which my sister Petro referred to earlier, so there was no funding. When we invited people into those meetings, they piggybacked on our ideas, they took our ideas away, they funded them, and they created the COVDP and various other mechanisms. If we don't have political leadership that is backed by funding, if we don't at Africa level, at regional level, there's all this talk now about regionalization. If regional bodies don't themselves provide the funding, the age of charity, as I've heard many say, is gone. We need to start looking at providing money locally. We need to start looking and investing in our own people. Look, you said earlier, excuse me, about we're creating two worlds. I would say to you, Richard, that we're not creating two worlds. We live in different worlds. The world I live in is very different from yours. I mean, the world I live in is a world in which there are no diagnostics. You know, the wonderful work that Pak Budi, who I'm looking at right now in Indonesia, does, that we at FIND are working with him on, is making sure there's diagnostics capacity in villages to the lowest village level, because as you said, and because he is a banker and he understands a return on investment for health, he says that prevention is better than cure. Let's prevent the next pandemic. Let's prevent the next threat. Let's prevent people having high blood pressure and having to go to centers for heart transplant treatment or whatever else there may be, you know, but we have no diagnostics, we have no vaccines. Treatments for my country in Nigeria right now, a malaria treatment, one course of malaria costs about 80,000 naira. The minimum wage for a month is 30,000 naira. So imagine the people that are dying because they cannot afford to pay for a course of anti-malarials. We have to believe, so our political commitment begins, I would say, from the local to the regional to the global. We're talking today from the global level down, the champions of leadership. And I heard the previous speaker speak about Kofi Annan, but the age of that sort of quality of leadership, and I am so sorry because I'm the diplomatically undiplomatic and diplomatic one. The age of that quality of leadership is sadly lacking. Of course, we have, the wonderful Right Honourable Helen Clark, Mama Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, who I would like to express my condolences to today as her family buries her son. Just a sad thing. But leadership, and a woman in leadership, shows that she still puts her power behind this. I know she's still following this. Political leadership is critical, but political leadership is critical at local levels. It must be followed by financing. My country, Nigeria, just built a house for the vice president for 21 billion naira in a country where people cannot feed themselves. 21 billion naira is over about $30 million for a house for a vice president. We cannot talk about the world is not supporting us if we do not support ourselves. And I think that is one of the cries that I make to low and low middle income countries of the world. We cannot talk about the world leaving us behind if we ourselves are leaving the least in our communities behind. Look, I want to also say something very quickly about Act A, because Pak Budi mentioned Act A, and Helen in the session earlier that I was very privileged to moderate live in Sydney at the Global Health Security conference, we talked about Act A being what we have right now. I still continue to be the Special Envoy, very privileged to be the Special Envoy, having been the most critical critic of it on the outside, having come inside, as you well know, Richard, and just suffered the most incredible things when I came onto the inside. But I realized that one needs to collaborate, and one needs to cooperate, and one needs to coordinate. And it is a coordinating mechanism that we have in Act A. And as Pat Budi says, it is not perfect. It was not perfect, but it is what we have. Last week, I convened a meeting of the leaders as I ran down, I think maybe the day after I saw you at WHA, ran after Dr. Tedros and Mike Ryan and said, I had an idea. And they were like, oh God, this woman, what now? And I said, we have H5N1, we have Mpox in South Africa and in DRC, and we are here as Act A. Let us get ourselves together, because if we get together at this technical sort of organizational, institutional level, if I bring the big nine together, the heads of Welcome, the heads of Gavi, and thankfully we now have a woman who is also now in there, because I used to have 9 brothers and now I have 8 brothers and a sister. If we, with Sania Nishta, if we come together, maybe we can galvanize the political leaders. So I'm here to tell you today very happily that Act A is not perfect. I agree with Pak Budi. We really need a global governance system, but it is something that was launched by the government of France, who are launching the AVMA thing next week. I have my doubts about that. That sounds very much like a PR exercise. I will say it, it's an open forum. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. But Act A was also launched by President Macron a few years ago. And we continue now to not just be kept warm, but we're simmering, because we are on the brink of disaster. H5N1, it is not if, it is when. H5N2 killed somebody the other day. We have Mpox because we can't share vaccines with South Africa. We can't share vaccines with DRC. People will say, oh, we don't want the world to panic. And someone said that in my Act A meeting last week. But I said, what is the line between being prepared, which seems to me to be in that leaning back in the blocks, from my athlete life, as opposed to the ready, set, go, the B of the bang, as I remember somebody used to say. So we need to be in the B of the bang position. We need global leaders to get behind, be it the champions. We need to get behind the pandemic accord. We need to get behind global governance, and we need to be in a dynamic state of readiness, not just preparedness. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Yodi. Fantastic. And thank you for all the work you've done. I know it has been so challenging, doesn't even begin to describe it. But your voice and your actions have been pivotal to the successes that we have achieved. Let me turn now to Helen, who started us off. Helen's, your reflections on uniting leaders to prevent future pandemics, please.
I think what Yodi has just powerfully said, Richard, is this is not a theoretical exercise. We are faced with threats now. 85% of those deaths in DRC from Mpox are children under the age of 15. What if H5N1 gets away on us? And we still don't have the mechanisms for equitable access to what's needed. DRC hasn't got the vaccines. So, what we just need leaders to step up, to build the trust, to make agreement on a decent, fair, equitable global system possible. Now, we all appreciate the reasons for the trust deficit. It's not just about COVID, serious as that was. It's got its roots in the way high-income countries have responded to the climate crisis, promising money which is never delivered, playing it long and slow on every painful piece of negotiation. With COVID, the protection of intellectual property and big pharmaceutical companies over equitable access. This has been a key barrier to getting agreement in the pandemic agreement. I've never known a time when trust between North and South is so low. Let's not even start on the differential interpretations of the so-called international rules-based order, which the New Statesman took about in the last week or so, where rules apparently should apply to Russia and Ukraine and not to Israel and Gaza. I mean, we are living in times where it's impossible to build trust when people behave like this. So what we need is leaders who are prepared to step up to say, for heaven's sake, let's get a grip on this. These pandemics affect all of us, and we have to act. And if we could get together a champions group, I think their immediate agenda is very urgent and obvious. Champion a successful outcome to the pandemic agreement talks. Advocate for the scale of financing required. And the Indonesian minister's right. You've got to be on a war footing. You've got to have a mechanism that can scale up to a war footing. And then champion the development of more regional capacities for R&D, manufacturing, and distribution. And by the way, I mean, the focus on medical countermeasures to date tends to be more on the manufacturing, and we get the proposals for the factories in a box. Well, Moderna didn't last long with Kenya, does it? That's why you need the indigenous capacity, as Petro has been talking about, and is such a wonderful champion of. So, just so much to do. At the national level, yes, trust deficits there. Misinformation, disinformation got away on a lot of countries. And let's also call out, the really shocking news in the past few days that Reuters broke, that the Pentagon ran a disinformation campaign against the Chinese vaccines. For goodness sake, that feeds vaccine skepticism generally. And I have real fears now for what is the future of childhood vaccinations against the basic killer diseases, the diphtherias, the whooping coughs, the measles, if we let this kind of misinformation persist. And I think it's disgraceful that the Pentagon saw, an opportunity to weaponize this in the context of us needing people to be vaccinated. So much to do, so much for sensible people who can step up to leadership roles to advocate for. You're on mute, Richard.
Helen, thank you. I do have one question that I'd like to put to you, if I may. It's from DevX. And the question they have is, you've got many practical recommendations in your report, but from your perspective, which ones do you feel most hopeful about for getting sufficient support in the coming months?
So I think that a pandemic agreement is doable with a lot of champion. I think we need leaders much more engaged. They haven't been. My experience has been when you go to a Minister of Foreign Affairs, they say, what are they talking about? Leaders hadn't heard of it. Ministers of Health often weren't involved. The level of negotiators was often quite low. So I think engaging leaders more, trying to bring into the pandemic negotiation more of the working mechanisms that worked for the IHR negotiation. I think very, deliberate efforts to try to build trust among negotiators again. I think we're all thinking of a certain date in early November when, if the US election went a certain way, you'll never get agreement on this pandemic negotiations. So I feel if we could seize the momentum of what happened at WHO on the IHR, we might just get there.
Okay, very interesting. And again, very quickly, your recommendation to consider splitting WHO into two components, one a World Health Emergencies program, very controversial, practical?
Well, it's essentially what happened at FAO, wasn't it, when the World Food Programme was split out all those years ago? And it is controversial, and as I said, it's an open question, and I have an open mind on it. But the problem is, I think, that the health emergencies are so all-consuming, and you can see the Director General has put his heart, his soul, his whole being into advocating for those whose lives and health are being devastated by emergencies. But does it leave room for the other essential functions that the world's premier global health organization ought to be doing? That's why I say it's an open question. Can we do both? And I'm also conscious that WHO is so constrained for funding for everything else. So many of their vital tasks are not able to be funded out of the core program.
Thank you, Helen. And thank you, to all of our speakers today, to all of you who've attended. This has been a very sobering update. I think we can agree on that. And there are indeed many reasons to be anxious about the future. But I'm also ending this discussion quite optimistic, because there are many occasions over the next 12 months where there can be that political pivot towards stronger, more assertive action. There's the General Assembly in September. There is the G20 meeting in Brazil in November. There's the Executive Board in January 2025. It's up to all of us, not just the panelists, but all of us on this call, all of you, to make sure that this pivot happens. Now, for any media who would like to join, there will be a short Q&A after this event, and in the chat you will see the link to that Q&A. But please give a round of virtual applause to our fantastic panels and speakers, and particularly to Helen and Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf for leading this really remarkable piece of work. Thank you very much indeed to all of you.
Thank you, Richard.